Hello historians, this is Mrs. Tyler. Today we are going through Unit 1, Notes 3. We're going to talk about the different issues that the framers of the Constitution came across as they began to write the Constitution and some of the compromises and resolutions that they came to in order to move forward. All right, in your notes packet you should be on Notes 3 for Unit 1. So, when the convention was underway, it was decided that the government would be split into 3 branches. This was one of our 7 guiding principles of the Constitution, separation of power. It's one of the ones we talked about in our last set of notes. The branch of government that was going to make the laws would be our legislative branch, and that was going to be made up of representatives from every state. The first issue that the Founding Fathers began to struggle with and found divisive and they fought over was how many representatives each state should send to this lawmaking branch of government. So under the old Articles of Confederation, the way they had it set up was that states could send as many delegates as they wanted to Congress, but when it came down to voting and passing laws, every state got 1 vote. No matter how big or how small that state was, it only got 1 vote. So those from the largest state at the time of Virginia, they were arguing, no, this should all be based on how many people live in the state. So, like Virginia would have said, big states with a lot of citizens felt that they should send representatives based on how many people lived in each state. Okay. Smaller states, though, like, for example, Rhode Island, who decided not even to show up with anybody at the Constitutional Convention, they were worried that bigger states like Virginia and New York would overpower those smaller states, and they wanted all states to send the same number of representatives to government. So New Jersey and Rhode Island and Connecticut, they're worried that if the larger states get to send more representatives, then all the laws and all of the things that are decided in that legislative body are going to favor large states. And then the small states are saying, well, why should we even show up then? So they're saying that all states should have an equal say in the lawmaking process. So they argue over this for quite a few weeks, and it gets pretty intense. But what they end up coming up with is a compromise. They call it the Great Compromise. They're going to take the legislative branch and they're going to divide it into 2 houses in Congress. So we call this a bicameral legislature. You don't have to know that big fancy word yet, but you think of the word bicycle, it means that it has 2 wheels. Think of Congress as having 2 wheels. The front wheel is going to be the House of Representatives. This is going to be based on population. So the more people that live in your state, the more representatives your state will get to send to the House of Representatives as in that part of the lawmaking body. And the back wheel is going to be the Senate. This is going to be equal representation, so every state is going to get to send 2 senators. Now in Minnesota, we have 8 representatives and 2 senators, just to give you an idea of what that looks like today. So this was a way to compromise and allow both big states to have their proportional representation based on population and still make sure that those small states are equally important and that their voices are heard and that they're not always overpowered and overruled by the big states' needs. The second issue that comes up then, because we're going to look at each state's population and determining how many people they get to send to the House of Representatives, the Southern delegates want to count slaves in their population. This is going to give them more representation in Congress. They want to do this not because they care about the humanity of the people that they own as slaves, but because they want to basically pad their numbers. The more people they get to count, the more representatives they get to send to Congress, and with more representation in Congress, that will hopefully keep them and protect their right to continue to use slaves as workers. So this is not out of compassion that they want to count slaves as human beings. This is more out of with the idea that they want to use slaves to pad their numbers and be sure that they have a bigger voice in Congress, which they would then use to keep slavery as long as they possibly could. Now, many northern states had made slavery illegal already. Many Northerners, some of whom were even at the Continental Congress, like Ben Franklin, considered themselves to be abolitionists, and they wanted slavery to be abolished. And so they didn't like this plan at all. They thought that the Southern states, if you treated your slaves as property and you didn't recognize them with people with full equal rights, then they shouldn't be able to count them towards their population. Southern states were more rural. They had smaller populations. They feared that the northern states would pass laws to end slavery. So the Southern states' argument is that if we can't count our slaves, the northern states will get to send more representatives to Congress. And then northern states are saying, you don't even recognize slaves as human beings that are people with the same rights. You can't be counting them in your population in order to just use them for numbers so that you can send more white guys to Congress and pass laws to keep slavery around forever. So they fought over this for a long time. Some of the southern states threatened to leave the whole Constitutional Convention and not even participate anymore if they couldn't get more representation in Congress this way. So this resolution is called the 3/5 Compromise. Ben Franklin actually nicknamed it the odious compromise. And odious, the root word of odious is odor. So basically, Ben Franklin is saying this compromise stinks. It's the stinkiest compromise ever. And this is why. What they decide is that instead of allowing all the southern states to count every single slave, even though they weren't going to give them equality, each slave would be allowed to be counted as 3/5 of a person. So basically, 3 out of every 5 slaves were counting towards those states' populations. Congress also agreed that they could not make any laws about slavery or the slave trade for 20 years. And that ends in 1808. So that's the odious or the 3/5 compromise that they came up with in regards to slavery. We're also, many of us are reading a play in class called Neither Free Nor Equal, and that play will also highlight this odious or the 3/5 compromise a little more in depth, so watch for that. All right, the last issue that they fought over as they're deciding this is going to be over the executive branch or the president. Okay, the Congress or Constitution establishes an executive branch to enforce and uphold the laws. Some delegates wanted this branch to be made up of 3 people. I can't even imagine trying to vote for 3 presidents. Some wanted this to be one powerful person, but they wanted it to be elected by members of Congress. So this people would vote to send their representatives to Congress, and those representatives would then choose the president. Others argued that this would make whoever was chosen as president would end up owing Congress for choosing them, or wanting to please certain Congress members to get their vote in the future, so that they would always owe Congress. They would do whatever Congress wanted. Some delegates wanted the chief executive or the president to be elected directly by ordinary citizens. Others worried that the average person wasn't educated enough. Not everyone back then was able to go and get an education. Not all adults could read and write. They didn't have social media. They didn't have news. They had newspapers, but not everyone could read them. But they didn't have like news, TV, and radio and all that stuff to get information out there. So it was really tough for many people to get information on who was running for office. So there's kind of something to be said about this, that not everyone was educated, couldn't really gather the appropriate information on the issues and the candidates that were running. All right, so the arguments are Congress is saying average citizens aren't educated enough to wisely choose a president. And ordinary citizens are saying if Congress chooses the president will only do what Congress wants. He'll always be like owing Congress for his votes. So what they come up with was a pretty brilliant plan called the Electoral College. This is where each state would send electors to an electoral college. It's not a school, it's just an organization that meets when we have a presidential election. So the electors would give their vote to the candidate who won the popular vote in their state. So how it works is it's based off of the number of people we send to Congress. So in Minnesota, we have 8 representatives. So we have 8 congressional districts in our state of Minnesota, and we have 2 senators. That equals 10. So our number of electors that we get to send to the Electoral College is the number 10. Okay, it's based off of population, but it also gives a little boost for some equality so that every state has a little bit of a say in choosing the president. The electors then meet, and in Minnesota, when we have our election, whichever candidate gets the most votes or the popular vote in our state will get all 10 of our Electoral College votes. Okay, the candidate who gets 270 of the country's or Electoral College votes wins the presidency. We talked about last week earlier in notes, we talked about how we are not a direct democracy. We do not govern with majority rule, and that applies to the Electoral College, and our founding fathers were very, very purposeful in this. They did not want the big, powerful states to have all the voice in choosing a president, and the same is true even today. Alaska has a really low population, so they have 1 representative and 2 senators, and they get 3 Electoral College votes. Okay, that gives them a little bit of a boost so that the people in Alaska, their voices are still important and heard when it comes to federal elections for president. So otherwise, if we don't do this and we just move to a strictly popular vote across the whole country, there are 4 or 5 cities in the country that have enough people in them where those 4 or 5 cities could always choose the next president forever and ever from this point on. And that would make it so that the rest of the country, the more rural parts of the country, the farmers in the Midwest, all these different groups of people who are not in those 4 or 5 big cities, their voices would never matter and they would not be heard in the election. So the Electoral College was a brilliant and helpful plan. It helps us balance our desire for this democratic process, this popular sovereignty where people vote for their leaders, but it balances it with the method of protecting the minority, protecting the smaller states, protecting more rural areas, and making sure that every vote matters. Okay, so one of the things I wanted you guys to think about is how have things changed since 1787 that impacts our election process. School is required. More of our Americans are able to read and write by the time that they are 18 years old and able to vote. We have more ways of getting information. We almost have too many ways to get information on candidates, and we have to really sift through what's truthful, what's legitimate, what's fake news, what's being exaggerated. And so that can be really difficult. Citizens, though, today know way more about issues and candidates than they were able to find out back in 1788 when we had our first, or 1789 when we had our first presidential election. Okay, so the delegates spent the long hot summer of 1787 debating all these aspects of the new Constitution. On September 17th, 1787, the delegates declared the Constitution to be complete. Ben Franklin said, "I don't entirely approve of this Constitution," especially things like the 3/5 compromise and whatnot. But he pointed out that, hey, this is a convention. It's got human beings. The humans are not perfect. There's no way we could create something that would be entirely perfect. And since humans aren't going to be perfect, there was no way to have a perfect document. So he felt that the Constitution was as close to perfect as possible. Many of those who didn't agree with everything in the document were willing to sign it anyway and say, hey, we know we've got work to do, but let's get this Constitution ratified by the states and approved and in action so that we can start looking at the flaws and fixing those flaws. Okay, the signed draft of the Constitution was then printed off and sent to every single state. They published it in newspapers. People who could read and write and had access to it would spend the next year reading about it. Each state would have their own conventions, and the state representatives would have meetings to look at this new constitution and decide if their state was going to approve it or ratify it. Okay, the Constitution needed to be ratified by 9 of the 13 states in order to become the law of the land. So we have 1788.